There's so many questions people have on halacha, chinuch, relationships, mental health, marriage, hashkafa, and everything in between. Every 2 weeks, I discuss them with senior dayanim of the Kehilas Federation. I'm Mena Reisner, and you're listening to Asking for a Friend. And welcome to the Asking for a Friend. We're back this week with the Rav Rabbi Zimmerman to continue our series on stock priorities and the way we give in 2026. I highly recommend that you listen to part 1 first, as there may be many of your questions that have been discussed already there. So thank you very much for recording with us again today. And I just want to start off today's episode by asking, what should a person's general approach be to tzedakah today? Is it something to aspire to? Should a person look at it as an absolute obligation, much like any of the other mitzvahs? Should a person be constantly busy with it, constantly assessing his personal worth to see if it allows further giving, makes more certain months? Should a person's mind instantly go to tzedakah? How much of a person's life, financial life, should be run with the thought of tzedakah in his mind?
I think we just have to clarify there are two things. There's tzedakah and there's meiser. Tzedakah means if a poor person comes to me and asks for money, I have a chiyuv to give it if I can afford it. That is one obligation. That is reactive. Then there's a different mitzvah called meiser, which means I am mafresh money and I give it out even though I'm not being asked. I'm being proactive and looking to give out money. That is a totally separate inyan than tzedakah. The chiyuv of meiser is one opinion, the maril, that it's a chiyuv deraisa. Many hold that it's a drabanan, but the majority of shittas hold that it's a minig. The early minig, even the Avos gave meiser, chalash atitin li aser aser en lach, but nevertheless it's a minig. So there's a difference between tzedakah and meiser. Tzedakah is a chiyuv if you can afford it, but meiser is a minig, although a well-accepted minig. Now, depends what a person can afford. The Rambam says, in Reish and Aleph, that parnassus atzmai koydem leparnassus chaverei. First, you have to have enough money for yourself, and only then should you give meiser. The Aruch HaShulchan says that means you have to have enough for basic needs. Once you have your basic needs, you should be giving. The Brisker Rav is quoted as saying that no, since the mitzvah of giving tzedakah is dei machsarei asher yasalei, whatever is the norm or what are the person's needs. So when the Ramah says parnassus atzmai comes first, it also means my dei machsarei. Why should I not have that dei machsarei and give it to someone else so he should have dei machsarei? And therefore, a person doesn't have a chiyuv until he has his dei machsarei. You know, when Moshe Feinstein used to be asked this question, someone would say, I have a mitzvah meiser, on the other hand, I can't really afford it. He would say, you should be mafresh your meiser. But then the halach is aniyah mishpachta chakaydim, so give it to your wife and children. That's how he used to approach it. So like I say, tzedakah is an absolute obligation, no different than putting on tefillin. Meiser is something being proactive. According to many shittas, it's a minig, and more importantly, it depends if you can afford it. For people who could afford it, it causes them to do what they should be doing anyway. For people who can't, they can't.
What about a chomash?
So the Rambam in Pirish Mishnayos says it's a chiyuv. The Rambam in Yad Hazaka says it's a mitzvah and a mofcher. And the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah paskin like the Rambam in Yad Hazaka that it's a mitzvah and a mofcher. Mitzvah is meiser, chomash is a mitzvah and a mofcher. What's pshat in the Rambam? Chayr is a steer in Rambam. Chida says he changed his mind. First he wrote the Pirish Mishnayos and he wrote it's a mitzvah. And then at a later date, he came to the conclusion that it's only a mitzvah and a mufcha. The Vilna Gaon holds that it is in a place where there are aniyim, which unfortunately there is, it is a chiyuv. So I want to know, is Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah say that it's a mitzvah and a mufcha? The Gaon says it's a chiyuv. Chavetz Chaim in Avos Chesed says it depends on your wealth. Someone who could easily afford it should give a chaimish, but a regular person should give meiser. Now, the lashon of Chazal is, Hamavazus al yavazus yaisim chaimish, but you can't give more than 20% because you might become poor. The Ramah says if a person is very wealthy, he can give more. At the point of death, they can give more. Chavetz Chaim says, if you're calling giving excess tzedakah and you shouldn't do it, imagine how important it is you shouldn't waste money on narishkeit. al yevazis. Even if stuck al yevazis eisem chaimish, so then you shouldn't be mevazviz on other things.
So the bottom line is, it's definitely a incredible mitzvah, possibly a chiyuv, but a person should know that if they can't afford it, or if it's a major stretch for them. How about if someone has supported a mossad or an institution for many years? Is there any form of Hazaka that develops, that creates a potential ongoing obligation? I mean, there's fundraisers certainly sometimes seem to push that on some level. They can almost say, we're relying on your donation, right? We've become used to it over the last 10, 15 years. Is there an element of obligation?
Again, the word Hazaka is a misnomer, because Hazaka means I have rights or privileges, not obligations.
Right.
In other words, if I live in someone's land for 3 years, I have a Hazaka if I have a taina. Or I got maftayena for 3 years in a row, then I have a privilege of it. It doesn't create obligations. Probably the word you're looking for is makirah kahuna. It says if you give your truma all the time to a certain kayin, you should continue to do so. And if not, you're a mechusar amana. Does that apply to tzedakah? The Shach and Reish and Zayin and some seifers say yes, it applies to tzedakah also. The Vilna Gaon in Chuvas Imre Yesher disagrees and says there is no such thing as makirah kahuna on tzedakah. If it's based on mechusar amana, people apply the Chacham Tzvi. Are you switching for no reason or because the circumstances are changed? Where circumstance changes, there's no din of mechusar amana. So if, let's say, all of a sudden a relative becomes in need, or a Talmud Chacham is in need, so then you can override the Hazaka aspect of it. But if nothing changes, that's a machlekes. As a matter of fact, this was subject to a great dispute. The Kollel Rameh Balanes used to be one large fund. Then people came along with an idea that let's divide it by countries, because people feel closer to their country. However, the downside in this idea, certain places were wealthy and certain places were not. So when they wanted to break off Kollel Ungarin, Kollel Hungary, Shem Rechemis, which is wealthier than the other ones, because the country was wealthier, or the Jews were wealthier, there's a question, are you allowed to do it or no? It's makirah kahuna, you're already used to giving to the general fund. And Chuvas Beis Shleima, he said, you're not allowed to do it, because you're taking away. People will be used to give to the whole conglomerate of aniyim, and now they don't. The Minchas Elazar in his Chuvas said makirah kahuna does not apply over here, and in fact he was one of the people who supported and started the break-off into separate groups.
So it's definitely not so posh at that. People could just say, it's my money and I'm deciding to give somewhere else. There is some element.
There is an element.
Right.
Others say makirah kahuna means I know him personally. That was one of the Minchas Elazar's.
It's on the institution.
It's on an institution. It's on a person. Makirah, I know him.
Right. That's very relevant, because if a Rosh Kollel or Rosh Shiva pass on, and then their son comes, or someone else, or a fundraiser becomes old, and the next one comes.
Right. So the Minchas Elazar said there's no makirah kahuna because it's a personal relationship. But like I say, it's something you should look into.
Many times people would feel that they'd want to give the mossad they learnt in, or the school they attended, more due to Hakarat hatov. Should one have more of a responsibility to these places that helped your journey, helped shape you, or your child? Is there an additional element of Hakarat hatov?
Hakarat hatov is not a chiyuv, it's a midah. It's a very important midah. We are called Yehudim because we have haidah. The Gemara says someone gives you something, even a drink, nafshei chayev lei. And therefore, it's a midah, it's not a chiyuv. It will not override other chiyuvim, but it will override other kedimus. In other words, if in the ladder of priorities something is a greater chiyuv, you can't override and give it to a lesser chiyuv because of Hakarat hatov. If, however, it's within the same rung on the ladder of chiyuvim, you can prioritize it because of Hakarat hatov.
Very interesting. How about if someone's child then has a negative experience in a mossad? Would it be considered legitimate to reduce or redirect your support due to a personal grievance?
I don't see why not. You have Tovas Hana who to give it to. And if you don't feel this cause is worthy, it's your money.
Another question that was asked was, how should a couple approach decisions about stock priorities when the husband and wife, let's say, feel drawn to supporting different causes. And I don't know if it's a whole sheer on whose money it is or not to go down there too much, but generally if a husband comes home and says, I gave X amount to this Moses, and she's like, what do you mean? There's other causes knocking at your door. How should... The
answer is, without giving the whole share, it depends whose money it is. If it belongs to the husband, then it's his money. If it belongs to the wife, it's her money. If it's in a joint account, it belongs to both of them. So that is the short answer. You're asking a Yeredeya question which has a Choshen Mishpat answer. There is one question which can be pinpointed in Yeredeya is, let's say it's his money. Aniye mishpachtecha kaidem, but your family comes first. What about it's his family versus his wife's family? What's called mishpachtecha? That is a Yeredeya question. And if you look in the Pischei Tshuva in Reish and Aleph, he says if that's the only question, assuming it's his money and thing, 3/4 goes to your family and 1/4 to your wife's family.
See, these answers in itself shows the level of detail that Rishonim, Achronim, and poskim until today, with the differences of 1/4 and 3/4, how important these halachas really are. Where people just feel this is my money, and there's systems, there's formulas, there's halachas.
If I want to retract on what I said, I don't want to criticize anyone today. I once heard a Moshe Feinstein speak at a levaya. It was in Borough Park. Man was Mr. Lax, an accountant. And he said that this is the only person who ever asked me shilas where to give tzedakah to. I get a lot of shilas if I'm mechuyev to give tzedakah, or how much I'm mechuyev, but where, he was the only person who ever asked me. And this is what he spoke about at the levaya. So if there's one misconception to correct, you should know that tzedakah is like every other halacha, and there are exact rules of who you can give to and how much and whatever.
We'd probably have to dedicate a completely different episode to Maisa. There's so many different Maisa questions, and that I think people are more aware of. But just to touch on it, if everyone in a school paid their full fees, then the fees would likely be lower for everyone. There's a certain amount that fees are higher due to inevitably some people not paying. So if I end up paying more because others can't afford to, can that extra amount count as Maisa?
There's a certain premise behind the question. Let's just take a mathematical equation. You have a school that has a budget of £500,000. There's 100 students in the school. If you divide the budget by the amount of students, everyone should be paying £5,000. If that is so, if you're paying in excess of £5,000, you're really paying for someone else's fees. Now, I say if that was so, because I don't think it's usually so. I think usually even the full tuition, if everyone paid, would not necessarily cover the budget. And they still rely on fundraising and charity campaigns or whatever. So it could be the premise is false. But assuming the premise was true, that you're paying more than the cost of educating your child divided into the overhead, so it really would depend like this. Let's say you're paying $15,000 and it really only costs $8,000 to educate your child. What you could do is, when you undertake to pay the $15,000, you say the $8,000 is an obligation and the $7,000 I'm giving as tzedakah, or I'm making an obligation to raise the money, and then you can raise it from yourself. If you don't say it, then you already contracted a £15,000 debt. You cannot pay debts from Meiser. But like I say, this is all on the premise that if everyone paid the full amount, the school would be fully funded, which I'm not sure it's truly so, especially if schools are catering to families that have a large amount of children. I don't think the full tuition would cover. I'm afraid it's a lot more.
So just to carry on the tzedakah and chinuch, at what point is paying for a child's chinuch considered an obligation? And when, if ever, does it become tzedakah? For example, regular school fees versus paying for a private Rabbi or private tutor. And would the fact that it's ruchnius, the fact that it's a private Rebbe rather than other forms of education, make any difference to it being tzedakah?
The basic answer is as follows. The halach is dover shebechayva in ba ela min acholan. Something which is an obligation can only be paid with your own money, not with meiser. There are two obligations in Talmud Torah. There's vishinantam levanecha, you're supposed to teach your child personally, and there's v'limadtem es b'nechem, you should make sure they learn. What is the difference? The Gemara says, "V'limatem es b'nechem is afilu b'schar." Shenantam v'necha is your personal obligation. V'limatem es b'nechem is you have to pay for it also. There is a difference in these halachas. Limatem es b'nechem, you have to pay for schar, is only to teach your son mikra, Tanakh, let's say. Once you get past that point, Mishnah, Gemara, or teaching a daughter, then there is no v'limatem es b'nechem, there's only v'shenantam levanecha. The Shulchan Aruch, the Baal HaTanya, writes that, of course, you should pay your school fees from your own money, but if you have difficulty doing so, he says that a boy, mikra, can't be paid for meiser, because there's a v'limatem es b'nechem, but everything else is a v'shenantam es levanecha, which is a personal obligation, but you have no obligation to pay money for it, and therefore you could count it for meiser if you can't pay it otherwise. Moshe Feinstein objects not to the premise, but he says today, if you don't send your kid to school, or even your daughter to school, where there's certainly no mitzvah of Talmud Torah, there'll be an apakaris, and therefore your chiyuv is to give a proper education. That being said, I imagine the Baal HaTanya would answer, it might be a personal chiyuv, but still not an obligation b'schar. And therefore the answer is, if someone can't afford otherwise, they can use their maisa money for girls' education or boys after mikra. I just want to make one more note. That's in a society where most of the people could afford. When you're in a society where most people can't afford, then of course they should pay from their maisa money. Because if you don't pay from your maisa money,
you have nothing.
A, you're going to have the school will collapse. Yeah. Two, so what does it mean? Okay, I don't want to give the maisa the tuition, so they'll have to take someone else's maisa. So what right does a person have to take his maisa and give it away so that someone should pay his maisa to take care of him? And therefore, in a society where the only way it could be sustained by maisa, then everyone could give everything. To answer the detail of your question, an extra tutor, which is l'chayr not a limatem es b'nechem, can be given for maisa.
We would like to thank Achi Samach, or AAC, for supporting this episode. What we're discussing here, supporting our local schools, chinuch and Torah institutions, is exactly what AAC is built around. Every pound of surplus generated by AAC is reinvested into those causes. And last year alone, AAC distributed over £1.5 million of its surplus to Northwest London schools and other chinuch and Torah causes, making a real difference to our community. For thousands of families, AAC is the way they organize their tzedakah and has been for over 45 years. It provides individuals, companies, and charitable trusts with one place to manage their giving in a way that's both tax efficient and straightforward, whether it's through the app, vouchers, cards, or online campaigns. And just on a personal note, I use Achi Samach, and it really does make giving tzedakah much easier. So just to answer the last point correctly, if someone isn't paying their full fees because they can't afford to, and yet they're giving some nicer on their earnings, are they allowed to give to another tzedakah? Because that means someone else is going collecting for them.
They can give a small amount because they might have a chiyuv to give, a chiyuv of tzedakah.
Right.
But they can't give large amounts because you're giving tzedakah of someone else's cheshbon, and someone should give their maisa. Someone should give their maisa to you so that you should be able to give tzedakah to someone else. So let the person keep his tovus hana.
Again, that goes into the whole world of maisa. I just brought this in here because someone asked me to, but this is probably an episode in itself. I'm going back to regular...
You mean when you say asking for a friend, it's really a friend and it's not you?
That's what I'm trying to make people believe.
Okay.
So every day in Shacharis, certainly here in London, a person could be approached by 3, 5, 10 people collecting for their different causes. In America, the few times I've been, it's way more than 10 people in Shacharis. So generally when Mushlochim collect in shul, is there any obligation to verify legitimacy for what you're giving? Because at the end of the day, giving out tzedakah money is an achrayus. It's a responsibility that you're giving to the right cause. Or can one rely on the communal norms, which is that Mushlochim circulates and everyone gives a small amounts and no one's inspecting their certification?
There's a Gemara in a Shulchan Aruch, ein boitkin lemezainis, aval boitkin leksus. So if you're giving a small donation, which is to provide food, you're not supposed to investigate the person. Until you do your investigation, the person can expire. If, however, it's for larger money, for clothing or for other expenditures, yes, you should investigate it.
So practically that means of how much you'll be giving?
Yeah. Or if a person's collecting, I need to have what to eat, so you have to give him right away. A person's collecting for something else.
But in many cases, then it's collecting for a medical emergency, for example.
A medical emergency, if it's an emergency, it might be the same thing as mezainis. But if it's for a long-term thing, as I'll say, baitkin l'ksus. Now, how you go about this b'dika is a different question.
Right.
But underlying principle that we have a responsibility to investigate, that's what Chazal say.
So, in order to give everyone in shul, which many people want to, then a lot of people have the 50p voucher books.
Mm-hmm.
Or they could be £1 or £5, but starting from 50p. Would the Rav say that's a good development to enable that everyone gets a bit? Or is there any diluting of the mitzvah just to give out a very small amount?
The chiyuv is, it says in Shulchan Aruch, that a person, you're the only one who knows he's in need, so you have to help him out to attend to his needs, if you could. Someone who goes to the public is noisen loy matanah mu'etes. By virtue of the fact that he chose to go to the public, that means he spread the responsibility on the public, and therefore all you give the person is a matanah mu'etes. Not only is nothing wrong with it, that's the halacha, that someone goes to the public, gets a matanah mu'etes. What is the definition of matanah mu'etes? Certainly 50p is a matanah mu'etes. Someone once asked me a shaila, do I have to give a shava pruta or even a pachas meshava pruta? Is all right. I said, if you don't mind getting it thrown back in your face, I can answer the shaila. Chuvas Maril Diskin, he says it doesn't have to be a shava pruta. He says, how do I know that? He says, it's a Mishnah. Mishnah in Bava Metzia says, Chamesh prutas heim. There are 5 halachas in the Torah that need a pruta, might have a mixus and whatever. If Tzedakah needed a pruta, then it should say Sheish prutas heim. So you see that you don't have to give a shava pruta. But anyway, that's the rule, that if someone chose to spread it amongst the public, then the public's obligation is only matanah mu'etes.
How about, again, this is another question asked, so not exactly on topic, but when envelopes come to their house or fundraising materials arrive, is there any issue in using the enclosed items? Sometimes there's a stamp, for example, to send back the donation, or they'll give you a pen or a calendar, all these things, and you have absolutely no intention of donating. Can you just use these items?
In Chuvas Igros Moshe, he says, it's based on American law, but I imagine it's universal, that in civil law you're not allowed to send someone an item that they didn't order and ask for money. So al pi din, it's a mechila from the organization, because they know this, and that is the minig HaMedina, and you're allowed to use it.
Very interesting. Okay, so in terms of priorities, and again, this is a very, very important and relevant question. There's so many important and valid causes, Baruch Hashem, these days to give to. You have schools, there's long-term institutions that are definitely vital for the kehillah's growth. And then on the flip side, you also have important life-saving work, right? You have Hazaka, you've got medical organizations, then you've got emergency appeals for almonas, for Yisomim. There's, in the category of crisis campaigns, people are inundated with all these extremely important and valid causes to give to. Where should the person begin?
I can tell you what it says in Shulchan Aruch about priorities. Not everything is covered. The Shulchan Aruch in Reish Mem Tes talks about 3 things: Talmud Torah, building a shul, and giving charity to the poor. And the Mechaber holds Talmud Torah comes first, then building a shul, and then charity to the poor. The Vilna Gaon disagrees and says charity to the poor comes after Talmud Torah, but before building a shul. So we have a machlekes between a shul and Tzedakah Aniyim, which one comes first. The Chachmas Adam says that certainly if a person needs food to eat, that comes before everything else. We're arguing about the Dei Machzorei. Dei Machzorei means providing someone with their needs, the needs that the person has, albeit it's not necessities. When a person has what to eat, but he's lacking in Dei Machzorei, so which one is more important? That's what the Chachmas Adam says, that once the person has their needs, and then the tzedakah is only day machzorah, that's where the Shulchan Aruch and the Vilna Gaon had a machlekes how to juxtapose this with a shul. If a person doesn't have what he needs, in Pashut you have to give him. That's in Reish Mem Tes. In Reish Nun Beis, it says that pidyon shuyim supersedes every other tzedakah because it has an element of pekuach nefesh. So if we take the Shulchan Aruch, you would have pidyon shuyim, the person doesn't have what to eat, Talmud Torah, and then a machlekes between the Shulchan Aruch and the Gaon on whether shul comes before day machzorah or day machzorah comes before a shul. Now, but as we said before, that this is all when someone would just come to you and you're the person giving money. By definition, when a organization chooses to serve the public and goes to the public, then it becomes a chayvas tzibur. It's not a chayvas yachid. And therefore, yes, you have to make sure that, let's say, Hatzalah is funded before you're giving money to your shul. But you don't have to fund it single-handedly, and therefore you don't have to give all your money to Hatzalah or to emergency campaign. You have to do your part, and other people have to do their part.
So it all goes together. As soon as everyone must give, obviously your giving is less.
Less, and your chiyuv is less. And therefore, like I say, once all these people are going to the public, basically it's the public's responsibility to make sure that pidyon shuyim is funded, then Torah is funded, or then people have what to eat, then Torah, and then a machlekes a shul and the day machzorah. So that's how you have to look at it. Now, to bring up another point, which was really the point behind this initiative called Division in Northwest London, is that there's tzedakah and there's chiyuvim. For example, to build a mikvah in a town that doesn't have a mikvah, that is a chiyuv. It's not tzedakah, it's not charity. It's just it's in cheshemish, but it's not found in Yoredeya. That chiyuv supersedes all tzedakahs because it's not tzedakah. It happens to be a cheshemish obligation. You're a partner and you have to contribute towards it. And even if you don't use it, it says an older couple or people that are not married also have to donate to a mikvah. One of the things that are listed in Choshen Mishpat as a chiyuv is Talmud Torah, at least of Tanaikas Shel Beis Rambam, at least of schools. That is a communal obligation. It has nothing to do with the mitzvah of tzedakah. That's an obligation. Obligations always come before mitzvahs.
Right, so the Rav gave a very detailed seder. I think I need to do chazar on it.
I'm sure you'll listen to the podcast over and over.
Absolutely. But when a person should really have it's the Rav stressing person to have a spreadsheet. If he has, whatever it is, £1,000 a month to give Misa, and he's getting every Sunday 10 campaigns, a person should figure out with the level of priorities what's considered a communal organization, what's considered their private obligation,
and the priorities.
And the priority list.
Whether you want to print a spreadsheet or keep it in your mind, that's up to you.
Right. Yeah, like I said earlier, I don't know how many people are aware of the real halachic formulas there are to it. People are just, they give, and they figure it out.
I don't want to plug anything, but there are my shurim on Hilchos Tzedakah, which is found on Torah Anytime and the Federation website, where I went through the text of all of Hilchos Tzedakah and all the poskim on it and the practical differences.
Plugs are allowed here.
Okay.
Today there's an unprecedented level of Torah learning, probably more Torah learning than ever before in history. Is supporting Torah learning through a Yisachar Zvulun model something that every balabos should really strive for today?
I think the main thing is Hazaka Torah, as the Shulchan Aruch says, that comes before other tzedakahs. A real Yisachar Zvulun was Yisachar and Zvulun, who split. Zvulun gave half his earnings to Yisachar, and Yisachar learned, and then they split the schar. That is a real Yisachar Zvulun. Famous two brothers in Muncie. One was a very successful attorney, and one is a famed Talmud Chacham. And they actually split the money
equally.
Equally. That is what Yisachar Zvulun is. There's also a machlekes in the poskim. Do Yisachar Zvulun have the schar, or they double the schar? In other words, do you take the schar of Yisachar and give half of it to Zvulun, or no, they both get 100%? That's also a machlekes. As a matter of fact, someone recently asked me a shaila that someone offered him a Yisachar Zvulun to learn an extra hour a day. Should he be doing it? Or maybe he's giving away half the schar. And I told him, but could you do it without it? He said, no. I said, someone once asked the Chazon Ish's shaila, And he said that you shouldn't be thinking about schar, you should be thinking of avos Torah. If another hour of learning could be in this world, of course you should do it. You should do it without schar. Halach is kama v'kama if you'll get half the schar, and maybe you'll get the whole schar. So I don't think, again, the Yisachar Zvulun is just a model of packaging it. And like I say, a real Yisachar Zvulun is you split it 50-50. The concept is you want to have a chelik in Torah. When you have a chelik in Torah, like we told the story of Aaron, in the next world you actually know the Torah that was learnt. Furthermore, you should know the Chafetz Chaim in Avos Chesed says that the halacha of al yevazvus yosem achemish might not apply to Hazakas HaTorah because you're buying something. It's only when you're giving it away. But if you're buying a schus and you're buying even Torah knowledge, then maybe there's no al yevazvus yosem achemish. It's not a bizbuz. You're just buying something for yourself. So therefore, like I say, the main thing is to support Torah and to have a chelik in Torah. And like I say, the learning yourself, as Rabbi said, is for Pashat for Olam Hazeh. For Olam Haba, you can buy the schar other ways.
Right. I think the question was more the model of this is your younger man, right? Again, it's obviously some level of marketing, but you'll get your star of Yisachar Zvulun, and however, it's £1,200 a month.
I once built a shul in Muncie, and I asked the biggest donor to put his name on the building. He didn't want to. I said, put your father's name on the building. He said, if Hashem doesn't know what's going on and can't figure out to give schar to my father, then I'm not going to give money to your shul anyway. So bottom line is, HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows. It's a marketing model.
Right. Can a person ever give based on personal gratitude, which would take precedence over an objectively higher priority cause? So we spoke about the halachic formula before, but let's say a person really feels that this made them who they are.
It depends whether it's a chiyuv or a kedima. Hakarat hatov can't override a chiyuv. In other words, let's say pidyon shuyim comes before building a shul. So even if you have a lot of hakarat hatov to the Rav, it's not going to override the mitzvah pidyon shuyim. If, however, it's a kedima, for example, within the same category, there are rules of which go first. Ani mishpachtecha, ani ircha, whatever. If you have ani Eretz Yisrael, if I have a hakarat hatov to a certain individual, that might override the kedimas, but it won't override chiyuvim.
Mm-hmm. When does supporting family or extended family take precedence over communal institutions? I mean, we're taught that supporting one's own family takes precedence in Tzedakah. How would that apply when, let's say, the need isn't basic survival, helping a relative, a sibling, afford a holiday, while unrelated families are struggling with essentials? Does family still come first, or do objective levels of need override the family priority?
Two separate questions. There's one, supporting family, does it take precedence over communal institutions? Supporting family is within Tzedakah, which is Tzedakah l'aniyim. It says, Ani mishpachtecha, then Ani ircha, then Ani Eretz Yisrael, and then Ani ir acheres. So it's a kedima within Tzedakah itself. But then you have to place Tzedakah within the pantheon of other chiyuvim. If, let's say, Hazakas HaTorah would come before Tzedakah, so then it doesn't make a difference that it happens to be your family. Now the other question, family comes first, but what happens if their need is not as great?
Right.
And it's interesting to note, when you learn Shulchan Aruch, it says all types of kedimas, ani ircha, ani mishpachtecha, ani Eretz Yisrael, Kayin before a Levi before Yisrael, a Talmud Chacham, even a Mamzer comes before a Kayin Gadol. It doesn't talk about need. And it's a glaring omission. And in fact, the question is even greater, that if you look in the Sifri, where you learn out all these kedimas from the pasuk, Ki yiyeh b'cha evyain, b'achad arecha, b'achad sharecha, that's how we learn out all the kedimas. The Sifri on the pasuk, Ki yiyeh b'cha evyain, says, Ta'ev kaidem. Whoever is poorer comes first. And some sefer, they all paskin like that. That of course all kedimas that are found in Shulchan Aruch are only when the need is equal, but greater need always comes first. Let's say, for example, Ani Ircha comes before Ani Eretz Yisrael. But the person in Eretz Yisrael can't pay his electric bill, and the person here can't go on holiday. Although it's Tzedakah, because it's Dei Machzorei, it's the person's needs, but of course the person who can't pay the electric bill comes first. So the question is, why isn't this in Shulchan Aruch? And the Marsham in his Truvas was asked this. It says it in Zifri, it says in Afla, it says in Cham Sefer, but it's not found in Shulchan Aruch. What do we paskin, and why doesn't it say in Shulchan Aruch? And he says, Avada we paskin like the Zifri. Why doesn't it say in Shulchan Aruch? Merov Pshitas. It's so obvious the Shulchan Aruch doesn't have to say it.
Wow.
The Shulchan Aruch is telling you Kedimas within the same level. But if someone is in greater need, of course that comes first.
But that practically means that it'll be rare for someone to help out a family member. There's always going to be Eden in a much lower level of financial situation.
Again, when it's a communal obligation, you only have to give a small amount. So we're talking about when people are coming to you, let's say specifically. I know of one person who has a greater need, and one person is a family member, so that goes, greater need goes first. The second, it becomes a communal obligation. Everyone only has to give a smaller amount.
Right, but let's say the aniyim and Eretz Yisrael is a communal obligation.
But nevertheless, yes, need is the greatest factor. I would say, more fundamentally, need is a definition of tzedakah. It's not a kedima. Kedima is a priority. Need is not a priority. It's the very definition of what tzedakah is.
Right. But there's halachas in tzedakah about a person who is used to a certain lifestyle. I think the Gemara says, or Shulchan Aruch says, that you have to, if he was used to having a horse and he was the only person in the village, then you have to get him a horse.
Right. That's day machzor.
Day machzor. So how does that work with, if let's say a person can't afford a holiday, could that be as important to him as someone buying shoes for Yom Tov?
That is what the drush of Tov Kodim is coming to Lafuke this.
Is there a greater hiddur, is there a greater advantage in giving directly to an individual? So let's say you know a Talmud Torah in town, lives around the corner, struggling financially, and you have a choice to either give your mitzvah money to him directly, you could post it through his door, or through an institution. So let's say a kollel where there's going to be overheads, there's going to be building costs, there might even be marketing costs. There's so many different costs in running a kollel versus you giving directly to someone's door.
Institutions or organizations, by definition, always have overhead, but they also might be more efficient. So you can't just look at one part of the equation, which are higher costs, but also which one are more commercially efficient. Let's say we gave an example. I can give food to my next door neighbor, or I can give it to an organization that buys food in bulk, and therefore their costs are lower, albeit they have overhead. And you can only figure this out by looking at the entirety of the picture. And not only that, we're obligated to look at the entirety of a picture.
Where your money can have a further reach.
Where it will accomplish more. I'll tell you an interesting story. And you want to learn in Yerushalayim, one of the musts were Reb Shalom Shadran's Chumash every second Friday night in Zichron Moshe. And he once told a story as follows, that he went to a certain town to exhort people to keep Shabbos. And he was being successful. All of a sudden, that town, they opened a mixed swimming pool. And he said, I had bothered me so much, this terrible breach of tznius, and I started being meicha against the swimming pool. When I did that, everyone decided I was a fanatic, and I lost all the people I was inspiring for Shabbos. And I was wondering to myself, did I do the right thing? Should I look at it in general, what was more important? Or do I look at it, if there's a person in front of me, I have to say something about it. I went to ask the Brisker Rav, was I right, was I wrong? And if I was wrong, what was I over? And the Brisker Rav said very interestingly, you are over a nasata v'nasata b'amunah. Rav Shadran said, what did it have to do with this? I'm totally honest. I don't take money for my speeches. I'm totally honest. The Brisker Rav said, there's an alternate pshat. Nasata v'nasata b'amunah is where you're business-like in doing your mitzvahs. He said, if you were running a business and you had a big customer, and then a small customer comes in, would you drop the big customer to buy even though customer service is very important, would you drop the big customer to deal with the small customer? No. So he says, you should know that Shabbos is a bigger customer than tznius. So you shouldn't have dropped Shabbos for tznius. He says, you are over, the Lashon of Brisker said this, how he said it over, medav zayin sachrish in mitzvahs eich. That's nasata v'sata munah, where you're business-like in your munah. In other words, we're very sophisticated in our own personal matters, and we balance everything. And when it comes to mitzvahs or it comes to tzedakah, we do things blindly without thinking. And the Brisker said, no, you should be business-like in your amunah, matters of amunah also. So therefore, you cannot ask this question, yes, one has overhead, one doesn't have overhead, but one might have greater benefit, and therefore you'd have to look at the whole package.
It's a fascinating story.
Yeah.
It's also very relevant for fundraisers. Sometimes you hear of going to someone to raise money, and then they'll give them a piece of their mind. And in a yashristic way, they want that person to become better. And that person will be like, no, get out my office. I don't want to give you any more. And that person feels good to themselves that they took a stand. But sometimes
it was the wrong thing to do.
Yeah.
A superb fundraiser. Once heard from my wife's grandfather, Moshe Rottenberg, was a Shiva of Ger. And he was a Talmud of Meir Shapiro of Lublin. And he said that he once knocked on the door, came in, or I think it was, he thought the person said come in, and he didn't say come in. And he came in, and the person was so enraged, he threw him down the steps. You imagine if Meir Shapiro would come to our house, would have such honor, they threw him down the steps. He said, what did my Rebbe, Meir Shapiro, do? He walked back, dusted himself off, walked back up the steps, knocked on the door. The person opens, he says, you again? He says, no, that was for me. What are you giving for my yeshiva? But yes, you do have to be... one has to be businesslike, and it has to be sophisticated in our mitzvahs also. Not be naive when it comes to mitzvahs, and all of a sudden, in your own matters, you're very sophisticated.
So talking about fundraisers, how should we view fundraising commissions? Many institutions have a professional fundraiser, many times the head of a mossad, or sometimes someone specifically hired for the job, and they need to make a living too. And sometimes rather than a wage, sometimes they're on a set commission. Is there any limits to the amount of commission a fundraiser can receive?
Is it justified? Again, you have to look at the entirety of the balance, how much more they bring for the mossad. What is the limit a fundraiser is allowed to take? Svarim, they quote various percentages. I saw one in a sefer on Tzedakah. One Rav said 25%, one said 33%, Chaim Kanievsky said 35%, and one said 49%. But I imagine it depends on what is the norm. Depending on what the norm is and what is the expectation, that is what it depends upon. Now, of course, if the meshulach is a poor person himself, so it doesn't make that much of a difference whether you're giving the mossad or you're giving him. Sometimes the meshulach might be a better cause than the mossad. We're talking about where it's a person who's just doing it as a pure business, so it has to be justified by the normal expectations. I'll tell you a story. My father-in-law, Rabbi David Danner, gesund, once told me that when he was learning in Yerushalayim, he decided to raise money for Kamenetz Yeshiva to help a Yisachar Shiner, who he was very close to. And he knocked on the door, and he had on the list that this person gave 50 liras last year. So he knocked on the door and said, you should know I'm collecting for Kamenetz Yeshiva, but you should know that I'm not taking any money. I'm doing it totally l'shem mitzvah, and therefore your donation will go further. And the person looked at him and said, you know something? Last year I gave 50 liras because I figured 20 goes to Meshulach and only 30 to the yeshiva. And I wanted to help the yeshiva. This year you're not taking a percentage. I'll give you only 30 liras. Sometimes it can backfire. But to answer your question, the answer is it justified if it's within the norms that everyone knows about? What are the limits? I imagine that also based on norms, although different shiurim limits are quoted in Svarim.
And I guess the same would be said about the administrative costs of
That's correct.
Running a campaign.
What
Same concept.
Are there excess? Is this in excess? There are certain charities, mainly non-from ones, that 75% of the donations go to administrative costs. So that is not justified. But if it's within reason, and this is the way you have to operate at Tzedakah, so then that's the way to do it.
How about a new kolel or new charity that comes around? So there's many times there's certain charities which are been around for years, decades. They're trusted, and they're kolim that have been around a long time. People know what's going on there. And then there's a new organization that comes out, a new kolel, which is very well marketed, and they don't have a track record, but it could be a fantastic place, and they'll do well. How should a person deal with stalkers when it comes to a new place, and you're kind of just taking whoever's presenting it to you's word for it, rather than the knowledge of it being a institution?
So using the Briskerov's Vart, we'd ask you, Nasata v'sata v'amuna. Are you being businesslike in your amuna? So let's think, what would you do in a business? Someone offers you an investment in an IPO, and as opposed to investing in a blue chip stock, which one would you do? And largely, I think you would assess what are the benefit-risk ratio. You'd want to know this person floating the IPO, what is their track record in the past? Who are the other investors? And then you would figure out a picture. You should do the same thing with a kollel.
So I was going to ask, well, how should a new kollel take off? But I guess there's the same answer as a new business.
A new business, yeah.
Bring the right ingolite and it'll spread.
100%.
Another point I've been asked to raise by a couple of people involved in collecting school fees on behalf of schools. What do schools do when parents go on a holiday, let's say, but they are not paying the full fees? Sometimes it's after parents have left the school, so they don't have the kids in the school anymore, and they have an outstanding debt, which they said they'll try and pay, and they seem to be living a decent lifestyle, and these schools get very frustrated that our debt should come first, and they sometimes can approach parents, and they're hit with a blank wall. So what should the school do?
The first thing is, let's say you gave the example, they're going on a holiday. Now, there are holidays and there are holidays. So you first have to judge, are they going on a lavish holiday or something which might be an absolute need? Family might need a holiday, they need a break, they need it for their mental health, they need it for their sanity, they need it for their shalom bayis. So you have to first balance that. Number two, there are people who don't have money, but they have wealthy family. And family helps them, but only for what they want to help them with. So you might see someone who can't afford to pay bills, and then he goes to a fancy hotel for Pesach. But it so happens to be it's his wealthy father-in-law who wants to have him at the Seder table and wants to say his divrei Torah and gematrias to his son-in-law. So there's a lot more that meets the eye, which is probably the chiyuv of having done kol adam l'kav zchus. Just because you see someone on a holiday doesn't mean that he can afford it, and doesn't mean that it's not a necessity. If, however, he's paying for it himself at the expense of doing his obligations, of course that is wrong. How are you supposed to collect money that owed to you? That is a profession on its own. But I must tell you something. The Chidah in Birkei Yosef says a person who's in debt should not give meiser. Because ultimately what you're doing is giving stuck with other people's money. You should pay off the debt and then only then give meiser. Now I've said over this Chidah, and someone says, okay, so I have a mortgage. I'm never going to give stuck anymore. And a mortgage is not a debt because what you're doing is trading finances for real estate. So that is not called a debt. I'm talking about consumer debt. Someone's running up credit card bills on consumer items which are getting consumed, then the person should not give meiser. He should pay his debt first, because otherwise he's simply giving meiser with other people's money.
Right. Rob was saying, just back to the original question, that is a general rule when people shouldn't judge a book by its cover, and although that person may be consumed with their responsibility and therefore could be a bit biased and look at everyone enjoying themselves while I have the horrible job of raising funds, it's not always as simple as what meets the eye.
And it's definitely a horrible job, but it says Gadol hama'asa yesum min ha'isa, the collecting of tzedakah gets greater reward than the giving of tzedakah.
Is it at all appropriate for a mossad, for a school, to require a pledge or a minimum commitment as conditions for enrollment? Let's say a school telling parents that they must help them fundraise, for example, or accepting a child literally on condition that you are going to pay a certain amount, and if not, we can't take you in. Is such a thing acceptable?
I heard a podcast called Asking for a Friend, where they interviewed my friend and colleague, Diane Houle, and based on listening to that podcast, I imagine he would answer to you, it depends if it's a private institution or it's a communal institution. Right. Communal institution has to educate people, and the raising of the money is a communal responsibility. If it's a private institution, yes, they can do largely as they please, as long as they're fulfilling their responsibility.
We're very honored that the Rob listens.
100%. Wouldn't miss an episode.
And the point about schools, which again, very common, that they're telling their parents, you must take a page for the campaign.
As a prerequisite for coming into the school.
It's not as a prerequisite, it's in the middle. The heads of the school say, we're doing a campaign, we want every parent to take a page.
So you want to do, they have a right to demand something more than the agreement? But no. they can ask, Tzakaras hatov.
So, just to wrap this up, much of this episode has focused on the dilemmas, the complexities surrounding tzedakah, how to give wisely, responsibly, with a proper perspective. But alongside those questions stands a undeniable reality, really, that the extraordinary generosity of our generation, and across the Jewish world, countless moistus, kolim, schools, chesed organizations, life-saving services exist only because ordinary people give, sometimes quietly, sometimes publicly, often beyond what seems comfortable or beyond their chiyuvim. So while the mechanics of fundraising may have evolved, the underlying elements of responsibility and generosity within Klal Yisrael is truly something remarkable. So perhaps if the Rav could just close off with perhaps a reflection on the incredible amount of tzedakah that's currently being given.
It says in the pasuk, "Ve'escha l'goy gadol, v'avarechecha v'agadla shemecha." And Rashi brings down the Chazal, "Ve'escha l'goy gadol," this is what you say, Elkei Avram. V'avarecha, this is what you say, Elkei Yitzchak. V'agadla shemecha, what we say, Elkei Yaakov. When Avram Avinu saw this, he had chalishas hadas. Hashem consoled him, ve'yei bracha, b'cha chaisman. At the end of the bracha we say, Baruch Atah Hashem Magen Avram. Now, first thing you have to understand is, why did Avram Avinu have chalishas hadas? His son and his grandson are included in the first bracha of Shemoneh Esrei. What was the chalishas hadas over here? So an answer, Avram Avinu devoted his life to chesed. Yitzchak to avodah, Yaakov Avinu to Torah. Someone who devotes his life to chesed, it comes at the expense of Torah and avodah. And Avram Avinu did not reach his potential in Torah avodah because he was working on chesed. How could I say such a thing? Some Sefer says it. Some Sefer says on the pasuk by Stam that when Hashem was going to overturn Stam, he said, "Hamachasa ani Avram." Is it right that I should not reveal this to Avram? What is Hashem grappling with? And the Some Sefer says that Hashem was first thinking, so to speak, kaviyachol, that Avram should know himself what's happening in Stam. He's a Navi, and he should know. And then Hashem kaviyachol reconsidered and said, Avram is a Navi, but he didn't reach the levels of Nevuah that he could have because he was being Isaac in Chesed. And is it right that just because he didn't reach the levels of Torah and Avodah because of Chesed, is it right that I shouldn't reveal it to him? So some Sefer already said this Yisayid, that because Avraham Avinu was Isaac in Chesed, it came at the expense of other things. Now, Avraham Avinu was Isaac in Chesed because he thought it was the most important thing. And then he sees, you say, Elokei Avram, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov, we're all equal. And therefore he had Chalishas Hadas, maybe I devoted my life to the wrong thing, which came at an expense of the Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov. HaKadosh Baruch Hu consoled him and said, B'cha chaisman, at the end of the time, at the end of the days, won't be so much Torah. There won't be that much Avodah, but Chesed will always continue. And B'cha chaisman means that the Geula will come in this Chus of Chesed. B'cha, with your midah of Chesed, chaisman, that's what the Chasima is going to come with. I once heard a mashal. There once was a king who had an only child, a prince, and this prince one day got married. And all the kings, all the people of the kingdom came bringing gifts to the wedding. And to get in, just out of etiquette, you had to have a gift. There was a couple who they served as the caretakers of this prince. And they felt very bad. They felt very, very close to the prince. But they didn't have any gifts to bring. They were simply very simple people. But they wanted to go to the wedding. So they came, and everyone's bearing gifts, and they were bringing nothing. And they went over to the king and said, listen, we don't really have any gifts to give, but we are the people who took care of your son, and we promise we'll always do it. And he said, that's the greatest gift. The nimshal is, Muvan Ma'atzmai, one day Hashem is going to make a party for the prince. Hashem is the king, and the prince is the Melech HaMashiach. And Melech HaMashiach is going to show up one day very suddenly. Navi says, "Upisoim yovai elai cholai ha'odin asher atem mevakshim." Suddenly, he'll appear. All of a sudden, Mashiach will be here. And all the generations, and to be Tchias HaMesim, and all the generations are going to join together for a party. And everyone's going to bring their attributes. So, the Rambam's going to come with his Torah. The Rashi, the Rambam, the Vilna Gaon, and so on and so forth, the Pnei Yeshua are going to come with their Torah. Then will be Baalei Avodah, the Arizal, the Shem Tov, the Chafetz Chaim, going to come with their Avodah. What are we going to come with? Do we have Torah? Of course we have Torah. But as a comparison to previous generations, it's a very poor present. Do we have Avodah? Yeah, we all daven. But to compare it to previous generations, you can't. But what we could say is that we are the generation who took care of Klal Yisrael, and will continue to do it. That's what it means, b'chachaisman. At the end of time, there'll be very little left. But the final dar will be outstanding in chesed. And there's no other way to describe our dar. And that itself will bring the geula. Yiratzen, in the schus of tzedakah, a meiser, a feeling of responsibility to other Yidden, we should be zeicher to the geula shlema b'mehera b'yameinu.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Nothing to add to that. That was a very educational and inspiring episode. Really appreciate the Rov's time. As always, please send in any questions, any feedback to podcast@federation.org.uk. Please feel free to share it if you feel you've gained from it. I'm sure there's other people who haven't yet discovered it. And thank you very much, Rov, for coming in again.
Okay, thank you for giving me the opportunity to share some Torah thoughts with people.
Thank you.